This portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, which became the world's most expensive painting, is one of the thousands of artworks stolen by the Nazis.
The paintings were taken out of my uncle's house, stolen with all the rest of the goods. In 1938, the trucks came and loaded everything.
The Holocaust was not only one of the greatest murders in history, it was also one of the greatest thefts in history.
The woman in the golden portrait, Adele Bloch-Bauer, left a will that was kept secret by the Austrian government as it fought off a Jewish family's attempt to reclaim the painting and 4 other works by Gustav Klimt after the war.
How do I feel about going to court, having to sue for something that is actually ours? I'm not a fighter, I don't enjoy it.
Either we are right or Maria Altmann is right, but no way in between.
There is something to be said for the sort of David and Goliath model, in that when you're smaller and faster than these big behemoths on the other side, that does sometimes give you an advantage.
It is still the victims of Nazi persecution who, all those years after the Nazis are gone, have to go out pretty much on their own, at their own expense, to pursue their claim.
The woman in the golden portrait, Adele Bloch-Bauer, was Maria Altmann's aunt. Maria's fight to recover the golden portrait and 4 other paintings by the artist Gustav Klimt led to a re-examination of Austria's past and the value of art. The paintings hung for years in the Bloch-Bauer home, where Maria was a frequent visitor.
I was born in Vienna in February 1916. My mother saw to it that I was raised in a very simple way. I wore the ugliest dresses in my class, and I was totally unspoiled. I had enough pocket money for chestnuts in winter and Italian ice cream in summer.
Maria's mother, Therese Bauer, was the sister of the woman in the golden portrait. The Bauer sisters married 2 brothers, Ferdinand Bloch, a sugar magnate, and Gustav Bloch, a Viennese lawyer. They became the Bloch-Bauer family. Adele and Ferdinand were childless. Therese and Gustav had 5 children. Maria was the youngest.
The thing I never realized was that I was born and raised in a very upper-class family. Every Friday there was chamber music at my parents' house. My father played the cello. Rothschilds had loaned him for life their Stradivarius. And we called it the 6th child because my father was terrified that anything could happen, and when we left for the summer, it was placed in a safe.
The Bloch-Bauer family were prominent figures in Vienna's thriving Jewish community. Vienna was the capital of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire that stretched from the Russian Empire in the north and east to the German Empire in the west, and then to Italy and Romania in the south. At the dawn of the 20th century, Austria's Jewish community helped Austrian industry and culture flourish.
For them, religion was not the main issue. They would invite artists and journalists and politicians and scientists to discuss matters in an informal way.
Adele was a woman of today that lived in a world of yesterday. If she would live today, she would have gone through the university, she would have had a career, she would have wanted to work, and that wasn't done in those days. She wanted to get out and be in a world that she could create for herself. And by having what they call a salon, she created that world, and she had all the people that she wanted to meet. She met them socially. They had fabulous parties. I remember her very well. I had a feeling she was very elegant, very aloof. She was always wearing a long white dress and had a cigarette holder. She smoked constantly and had these long golden cigarette holders.
Both Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer were great patrons of the arts. Ferdinand had a greater appreciation of old masters and older Austrian art, 19th century Austrian art, and Adelia appreciated the modern, the contemporary art more, and had close relationships with a number of artists. Oskar Kokoschka, who did a portrait of Ferdinand, and Gustav Klimt, probably the most notable of the artists whom they supported.
Klimt and Kokoschka were leading figures in the Austrian art movement, exploring fresh ways of painting, the Secessionists.
Those who went out of their way to buy Klimt were also embarking on a kind of adventure, a kind of cultural adventure. They were willing to take the risk of buying an artist who was making something new, who was making a new statement, who was part of a new movement. It was the moment of, Freud and Schoenberg and Karl Kraus and Schnitzler and Klimt.
It was a time when the young Austrian-born Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna with dreams of becoming a great artist. Rejected by the Vienna Academy of Art, he spent 9 unsuccessful years trying to earn his living as an artist. Klimt was Austria's most celebrated and expensive artist. Ferdinand and Adele were his patrons and friends.
She first began to sit for him in 1900, and the portrait wasn't completed till 1907. So obviously during this time, he made hundreds of sketches. During this time, they probably became very close, and he probably meant a lot to her. Klimt must have been a whole new experience for her. An artist, a man from a completely different class, a man who obviously also had intellectual interests. We know that he read Goethe, and then he apparently carried a copy of the Divine Comedy in his pocket. The fact that he socialized with so many of his patrons suggests that he had a lot to offer intellectually and socially.
When I asked my mother, was Aunt Adele a lover of Klimt, she said, "How dare you say such a thing? It was an intellectual friendship." Well, it may have been, but I don't know. I'm sure people at the time did the same thing. They do now, but they didn't talk about it. I always thought she was a cold person, but I'm sure Klimt didn't think so.
We know that that was his reputation, for painting these wealthy, attractive women and then possibly seducing them.
Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer was first publicly exhibited in 1907. 30 years later, the necklace would be a wedding gift for Maria from her uncle Ferdinand. In 1912, Ferdinand commissioned a second portrait of his wife.
It's interesting that Adele was the only woman that he painted twice.
Adele drafted a will in January 1923, while she was still a young woman. She made Ferdinand her universal heir, and she asked that after his death, that he donate the pictures to the Austrian National Gallery. In terms of legal ownership, I do not believe that she owned the paintings. First, because all indication is that Ferdinand commissioned the paintings or used his funds to purchase them. Second, because Austrian law in the interwar period was discriminatory against women.
In 1925, 2 years after writing her will, Adele died of meningitis. She was 43 years old. Her ashes were placed in the family vault in Vienna's Central Cemetery. Ferdinand turned Adele's bedroom in the Elisabethstrasse house into a memorial to Adele.
There was nothing in the room except beautiful flowers and the Klimts. We were always there on Sundays and holidays. I knew those Klimts so well.
Maria was just 9 when her Aunt Adele died. She grew up in a sophisticated family that felt more Austrian than Jewish. At 21, Maria married Fritz Altmann, a young aspiring opera singer. A world of promise seemed to stretch before them. The interwar years were a time of crisis. Defeated Austria had lost its empire after the First World War. What followed was economic hardship, political violence, and popular unrest. By 1933, neighboring Germany had a new leader who promised a return to greatness. The Nazis issued warnings to Europe's Jews.
Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden. Bitte, macht euch frei von der Judenführerei! Deutsche, wehrt euch, auch nicht bei Juden!
The anti-Semitic policies of Adolf Hitler found increasing favor among many Austrians who blamed Jews for the nation's plight.
You have anti-Semitism, and this made the situation very explosive. But You would be wrong if you thought that all the Jews were industrialists. Most of the Viennese Jews were neither very poor nor very rich. They were middle class.
Support for the Nazis in Austria grew steadily in the 1930s. One of their secret members was a Catholic lawyer, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. On the 12th of March, 1938, Hitler ordered German troops into Austria and installed Seyss-Inquart as Chancellor. It was the start of a career which would send thousands to extermination camps. The Germans absorbed Austria into the Third Reich.
The Austrians tried to say later that they were victims. There were no victims. They were totally happy, cheering. The church bells were ringing. The women threw flowers at the soldiers. And there was tremendous jubilation in the streets.
Hitler's return to his homeland brought tears to his cheeks, and a speech that he described as a report to history.
Ich proklamiere nunmehr für dieses Land seine neue Mission. Sie entspricht dem Gebot, das einst die deutschen Siedler aus allen Gauen des Altreichs hierher gerufen hat. Die älteste Ostmark des deutschen Volkes soll von jetzt ab das jüngste Bollwerk der deutschen Nation und damit des deutschen Reiches sein.
The rejected and penniless artist who hawked his paintings around the streets of Vienna was back as Führer.
Everything changed. There was still the last chamber music at my father's house the night that the Nazis marched in. And that chamber music ended the beautiful life for Jewish people in Vienna.
Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer moved to his castle near Prague in Czechoslovakia 3 days after the Nazis marched in. In Vienna, Austrian Nazis unleashed a reign of terror and theft against the city's Jews.
The anti-Semitic fervor and the violence of the Austrians surprised most onlookers, including the Germans. There were attacks on Jews in Vienna, in the capital, notorious scenes where Jews were forced onto their knees and required to scrub the streets. There were so-called wild Aryanization. And Aryanization is when property is stolen from a victim, a Jewish victim. But a wild Aryanization is a spontaneous act where someone is dispossessed, if you will. Going into a Jewish proprietor's shop, literally grabbing him by the shirt or by the coat and throwing him out the door, and taking control of his business, taking over Jewish apartments, going in and seizing property of this sort.
And Jews couldn't do anything against it because, of course, nobody would help them. If they turned to the police would just laugh and say, "I should help you. No, this is right. Your neighbors are right. It rightfully belongs to them. What you owned, give it to them." So they were really under pressure. They were really physically forced to humiliate themselves, to give away whatever they had. They had no chances to protest. And then the Nazi regime realized that by these wild Aryanizations, they would lose a lot economically. So the regime itself stepped in and said, well, now we'll do the expropriation systematically. It's not only about apartments, art collections, very private surroundings, but it's also about industries, about economic factors that were expropriated. We want to take the bank accounts, we want to take the insurances, we want to have the land they own, we want to have the houses, so the big issue is not just furniture. or art. And Jews had to fill property declarations.
My father went to the park with my mother in late March, early April, after the Nazis came. And in the meantime, the Gestapo came to the house and asked for the cello because they found it in the Rothschild possessions. And my father's butler gave it to them. And just like the thread of life was cut through, he died a few months later. The love of life, the strength for life was gone, and for a lot of people. They came to our house, and after a few questions, they asked me for my jewelry. I had gotten such gorgeous jewelry because my wedding was just 6 weeks before. And I was terrified that they would arrest my husband, Fritz, so I said, I have more at the jeweler. So after everything was brought in, including the diamond necklace of the famous gold portrait, they just took it and put it in a bag. Nothing was written down, nothing. They just poured it in a little bag, and then they arrested my husband a few days later. At first, my husband was in the prison in Vienna, and then one day I came and brought him his fresh laundry, and I was told he isn't there. I went crazy. I had no idea where he was. So I sent wires to everywhere. And I did send a wire to Dachau, asking if we had just gotten married, and do you have a prisoner there by the name of Fritz Altmann? And I have this wire which says, Altmann im Lager, gesund, der Lagerkommandant. Altmann in camp, in good health, signed the commander of the camp. My husband told me that in those days he was together with people that later perished in the worst way in the concentration camp.
With Maria Altmann's husband, Fritz, in Dachau concentration camp, Nazis seized his brother Bernhard's cashmere factory, one of the most successful in Europe.
The people that had taken over the factory went to see my brother-in-law in Paris and said, if you want to see your brother again, make your customers send their checks to us for the goods instead of to you to Paris. And my brother-in-law signed it, and they released Fritz the next day. So Fritz came home, the head was shaven, he looked awful and gaunt. It was horrible. My brother was arrested too. They said, Mr. Bloch-Bauer, where were you in the evening of New Year's Eve in 1934? And at that time, you know, it was 38. And my brother said, oh, that I can tell you, and I remember it very well, I was skiing on the Zugspitze, that's one of the high mountains there. He said, do you remember what happened at midnight? My brother said, yes, I do. We got an SOS call from the mountain. And I went up there with a buddy and brought the man down to the hut, or whatever it was, to the cabin, and saved him. And he said, this is correct, and that was me. And my name is Hitler. I'm I'm a nephew of Adolf Hitler. I'm going to protect you for the next 2 days, but get out as fast as you can.
Maria and Fritz Altmann, like thousands of other Jews, were now desperately seeking visas or other ways of leaving Austria.
We made 3 attempts to escape. One was a false passport that didn't work, and the other one was somebody was supposed to come and pick us up, and he got scared in the last minute.
Fritz asked his brother Bernhard to help them escape from Austria.
My brother-in-law had arranged everything from Paris, and so we took a taxi to the airport, and we got into the plane, and we sat down, and we had the seat belts. It was a tiny plane, and the staircase was removed, and all of a sudden the plane stopped, the stair was rolled back, and our hearts stopped because we thought they are coming for us. It was bad weather in Munich, and therefore we had to wait 30 extra minutes, which were like this. And then finally we took off. From Munich, we took the train to Aachen, and there we got out and took a taxi and gave him the address of that peasant. And then he didn't know exactly where it was. He said, I will ask at the border police. I said, no, I just remembered where it was. And so we got out and we walked, and a young priest came. There was these few minutes when there was no one at the border police. And he took us over, and then there was a barbed wire, and we had to climb over it. And for years, I kept the stockings that were torn on the barbed wire. And then the next day, the Gestapo came to my mother and said, we know where your children are, but we can get them back. And so my mother said, I'm sorry, but you are wrong. My daughter just called me from England. My mother got out totally legal. She had to pay Reichsflugsteuer, a huge amount of money, and she paid that, and then she came to England.
Hitler's policy of a Reich without Jews required a compliant population and thousands of bureaucrats. A key Austrian figure was a former employee of the Vienna Vacuum Oil Company, Adolf Eichmann. He began his Nazi career by forcing Jews to hand over property and money in order to escape from Austria. The job, he said, gave him uncommon joy. His career ended, sending millions to the gas chamber.
Before he was organizing the deportation to the death camps, Eichmann was based in Vienna. In the case of Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, he was accused of evading taxes, of having hidden income in previous years, and a fine was levied against him. This was a completely false, bogus crime that was justification, was aimed at the expropriation of his property.
The Nazis seized Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer's sugar factory, his house on Elisabethstrasse, his collection of porcelain and art.
They were taken. We didn't know where they were taken, but they were gone. friends of my parents had committed suicide because they didn't know where to go. Our pediatrician took morphine, and friends of my mother committed suicide, she with her son, because for people who had no money, no knowledge of language, there was a dark curtain, and behind that curtain was nothing. So what could they do?
On the 9th of November, 1938, Austrian and German Nazis subjected their Jews to fire-raising, pillage, and murder. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Rather than arrest the culprits, the Nazis sent more than 3,500 Jews to Dachau concentration camp. After Kristallnacht, it became almost impossible for Jews to leave Austria.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
By 1939, 120,000 Austrian Jews, 2/3 of Austria's Jewish population, had escaped, finding safety wherever they could. In March 1939, the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer fled to Switzerland.
The Prague residence that Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer had, a spectacular castle just outside the city, was occupied by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust. So the Bloch-Bauer family is tied up with this tragic history in a really profound, intimate way. One of the paradoxes of the Nazi regime was that the leaders, the most barbarous, malevolent individuals in history, thought themselves men of culture and were passionate art collectors. Adolf Hitler collected more art in a short amount of time than any individual in history. At war's end, he had over 5,000 old master paintings, a massive collection. What Hitler did was something to be emulated. Right after the Anschluss in March 1938, the Nazis let loose the plundering commandos and started to seize these works, both personally and for the museums of which they were so proud.
There was a tremendous interest in the Bloch-Bauer collection. In 1943, there was a huge exhibition. The biggest exhibition of Klimt ever done was presented in Austria under the auspices of the Austrian Nazi government. And our Adele Bloch-Bauer portrait was just labeled "The Lady in Gold." And of course, because of the thefts and the appropriations of so many paintings, they had on hand, in fact, almost the entire oeuvre of Klimt's work.
The Austrian artist Oskar Kokoschka, who had escaped to London, kept in contact with Ferdinand in Zurich.
It is a handwritten letter to Kokoschka, where he said, I'm living like a beggar, and I will hear in the next 2 weeks if they're at least giving me back my 2 portraits of my late wife.
The Nazis gave back just one painting. The portrait of Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer by Oskar Kokoschka. The Nazis labeled it degenerate art. Austria had a network of concentration camps. At Mauthausen, political and religious opponents, not just Jews, and thousands of prisoners of war were starved, worked to death, and gassed.
There was a myth that emerged that Austrians were the first victims of Nazi aggression. The reality is very different. Austrians comprised 8% of the population in the Reich, yet they were 14% of the SS, and they were 40% of the concentration and death camp guard staff.
Despite its complicity in the Holocaust, Austria's war crimes were virtually ignored by the Allies. The process of denazification that occurred in post-war Germany was almost non-existent in Austria. Maria Altmann's escape from the Holocaust ended in Los Angeles.
What happened to the paintings during the war, I cannot tell you. When I got notice of them again, they were back in the museum. I, at the time, lived here in Hollywood, in a little house, and had 2 very young children. I was only interested in raising a family. The last thing on my mind was property and jewelry and paintings. When we came into America, we lived on $35 a week. That's what Fritz made. We paid $5 for our apartment a week, and I paid $15 for groceries a week. My oldest son cost $50. That's what the doctor charged for the delivery. You can't buy a dog for that anymore.
After the war, the Allies sent back any looted art to the country of origin, to be returned to the rightful owners.
The American authorities gave the Austrians a free ride on this. It was during the Cold War, and the Americans wanted Austria on the side of the Western Allies. And so the Americans did not really scrutinize the Austrians and their role both during the Third Reich and even in the post-war period.
For more than a decade, a German lawyer and art historian has been following the trail of Nazi looted art.
All the curators, all the art dealers, all the art experts, all those appraisers in Vienna who went to countless homes to make those infamous inventories of art that the Jews had and had to give up and was sold. All these people resumed their careers after the war.
In October 1945, Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer wrote a new will.
He states very clearly that his property, including his art collection, is not to go to the Austrian gallery, and he does not act upon Adelia's request to give the Klimt paintings after his death. All his property is to go to his 3 nieces and nephews.
Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer died a month later, in November 1945. His ashes were placed next to his wife in the family vault back in Vienna. After Ferdinand's death, his Austrian lawyer, Dr. Gustav Klimt, continued to press the family's claims for their assets. Despite the Nazi seizure of the Bloch-Bauer paintings, the Austrian National Gallery claimed them as its own.
In 1948, our then lawyer, Gustav Klimt, who was a very good friend of the family, approached the authorities and told them that the family's financial circumstances had totally changed from what they were before, and that we need the paintings in order to make money and sell them, and we wanted them back.
Gustav Klimt appears not to have known the precise wording of Adele Bloch-Bauer's 1923 will, that it was a request and it was not a binding obligation. It was not her property to dispose of. And he was under the impression that these Klimts had already been given to the Austrian National Gallery.
In essence, the curators recognized when the Bloch-Bauer heirs came back to claim all the works, the porcelain collection, and the other paintings, as well as the Klimts, there was an awareness that that they were not operating legally.
The most difficult and pernicious obstacle to restitution were Austrian heritage protection laws and embargoes on the export of Austrian art from the country.
In order to be able to take things out, they had to strike a deal with the Austrian government and, quote unquote, donate, I guess as a sign of appreciation, certain works of art to Austrian institutions. And then they were able to take the rest out of the country. And if you would look at some of these cases, some of these files, it had every element of an Oriental bazaar.
It was clear in the late 1940s that the rest of the collection would only be released for export if the prize pieces, the trophies, so to speak, were to stay in Austria, and that's essentially what happened. And I think it was patently clear to everybody involved in the process that Adele Bloch-Bauer, the portraits of Adele Bloch-Bauer 1 and 2, were not going to leave the country.
She said, yes, there's one way in which we will give you this. And that is if you leave the Klimts here, and if you donate them to us, in that case, we will make an exception and let you take the others out. And that's exactly what happened.
The Bloch-Bauers had no choice but to leave the Klimt paintings in Austria. The property that was returned was shared by Maria Altmann, her brother and sister. The money raised helped Maria and Fritz bring up their 4 children in the United States. Others were not so lucky.
The degree of rip-off that these people experienced, the claimants, after the war, obviously always thinking that the war is over, the Nazis are gone, now we can go back and recover what is rightfully ours, that the way they were treated in their claims after the war was sometimes shabbier than the way they were treated 10 years earlier. At least they knew in the late 30s, early 40s what they had to expect, but many of them expected the best in the 40s and 50s to find out that what they were getting was the same rough deal they were getting early on.
The principal concern of Austria's first post-war president, Karl Renner, was to unify the country and rebuild the economy. He was dismissive of Jewish claims for the return of stolen property. Under pressure from the Allies, between 1947 and 1949, the Austrian parliament passed 7 restitution acts. But the Minister of the Interior, Oskar Helmer, urged that all restitution claims be dragged out for as long as possible.
In the 1950s and 1960s, there were, of course, restitution laws, also in Austria. But for the claimants, so the victims themselves or their heirs, it was hard to claim because, first of all, nobody would inform them about their right to claim. And they were, if they survived, they were in Southern America, in Northern America, in Australia. I mean, how could they know what the Austrians, what kind of restitution laws they issued? Second, it would cost them a fortune to have court proceedings here in Austria. And all these restitution proceedings would take years and decades until some kind of very questionable result.
Austria gained full independence from the Allied occupying powers in 1955. The country was prospering. Remarkably, in 1970, Bruno Kreisky was appointed as Austria's first Jewish chancellor. Kreisky paid no more attention to returning Jewish property than his predecessor. He even appointed 4 former Nazis to his cabinet.
Going into the 70s, most significant documents pertaining to art looting in Austria were destroyed, were deliberately destroyed. And therefore, we just don't know how much was taken. We just don't know how much disappeared.
In 1984, the editor of America's Art News started to hear disquieting rumors about a hoard of stolen paintings hidden near Vienna. On arriving in Austria, Milton Estero asked for permission to visit the 14th century Mauerbach monastery.
The first thing he said to me is, "Why are you here?" I reminded him very graciously that I had called him from New York and that I am with this art magazine and I'd like to find out more about the monastery. And I told him, I said, "When can I visit the monastery?" And he pounded his fist on the desk and he said, "You cannot go." I said to him, when I was a young reporter at the New York Times, a wise old editor told me that when somebody answers a question the way you have answered my question, that I should become suspicious that maybe you're hiding something. There were these thousands of works of art that the Nazis had stolen from Jews who eventually became victims of the Holocaust. And the works were just there. The Austrians were making absolutely no attempt to do anything about it. The story was published, and there was quite a commotion that developed as a result of that story. The Austrian chancellor went on Austrian TV and said, but we plan to do something, but they didn't do anything.
Yielding to pressure, the Austrian government circulated limited details of the art at Mauerbach.
Some of the people who did get would write back to the minister and saying, "Dear sir, these 2 paintings on the list, they hung in my parents' study back in Vienna before they were shipped off to Auschwitz, sir." And they described the paintings. In fact, they described the size of the paintings, 24 by 27. They said even what was on the back of these 2 paintings. This is an actual case that we wrote about, a woman who lived in New Jersey. She had everything. She described it perfectly, knew where the signature of the artist or. But they rejected the claim, the Austrians. Why? Because she had written that these paintings were 24 by 27. The paintings were actually 25 by 29. Now, how could she possibly remember the size, the exact size, 50 years after the fact? So this is the sort of thing that the Austrians were doing.
12 years after the revelations in Art News, Austria took decisive action.
In 1996, there is an auction that is held by Christie's, and the collection that had been housed in Mauerbach is sold and raises over $14 million that goes primarily to the Jewish community in Vienna, in Austria.
4,100,000 shillings for the very last guy. 4214.
The Mauerbach repository shows how the Austrians did not engage their Nazi past and did not work on restitution issues for decades and decades.
In New York 2 years later, the art world was shaken by an international scandal. The Egon Schiele paintings, Portrait of Valley and Dead City, were loaned to New York's Museum of Modern Art by the Leopold Gallery of Vienna. 2 visitors to the exhibition protested that the paintings had been stolen by the Nazis.
The 2 Schiele paintings were seized by the New York District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, saying that these Schieles were Nazi looted art.
All of a sudden, you have a seizure warrant. And with that, you go out and you physically take custody of a painting. Now, that makes a lasting impression in comparison to you threatening to sue.
Within months of the seizure of the paintings, Austria's Minister of Culture, Elisabeth Gera, presented a new art restitution law to the Austrian Parliament.
So the Austrian Cultural Minister established an art restitution law in late 1998. So theoretically, there's a new chance now for claiming to get something from the Austrian state.
The new law would oblige the state to return any paintings that had been forcibly donated in return for export licenses. Austria began to open its archives. One of the first Austrians to investigate the story behind the paintings was the campaigning journalist Hubertus Czernin. Czernin had previously exposed the hidden World War II army career of the Austrian Secretary General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim.
I went immediately together with a historian into the archives. One of the first cases we looked in was the Bloch-Bauer case. The work at this time was very, very difficult, as we were not allowed to make copies of the documents. We had to write all documents by hand. Usually as a historian or a journalist, you're used to work with copy of documents, seeing signatures, dates and stuff like that. And actually it took 1 year until I got the whole Bloch-Bauer file.
Without Czernin, we wouldn't have anything. Czernin helped us to get all the documents from the Belvedere, all the information.
Armed with this new information, Maria Altmann could now challenge the Austrian claims to ownership of the Klimt paintings. She needed a lawyer. She turned to an old family friend, Randy Schoenberg, the grandson of another Viennese refugee, composer Arnold Schoenberg.
Maria is a very close friend of my family. She was very close with my grandmother. And matter of fact, her husband Fritz and my mother's father were close friends in the 30s back in Austria. So when both families fled and ended up in Los Angeles, they maintained the friendship, and my mother grew up with Maria's oldest son, Chuck. So I can correctly say that she's known me since my mother was in diapers. So when she asked me in 1998 to help her out with this issue, of course I said yes.
Randy Schoenberg agreed to pursue the case on a no-win, no-fee basis.
When we received the documents, we really realized what had transpired after the war. If you had asked Maria Altmann before 1998 what had happened with the Klimt paintings, she would have told you exactly the same lie that she was told, that her family was told after the war by the Austrian government, which was that the paintings had been given by Adele Bloch-Bauer in 1925.
I didn't see the will of my aunt until 98. I had never seen anything. They never showed us the last will. And since I knew her love for Vienna and all that, I really thought she made a will, leaving it to the gallery.
And there's correspondence in 1946, 1947, especially at the end of 1947. The response from the Austrian gallery, as we know, was one of deceit. They said, there's this will, we have the absolute right to the paintings, hand them all over to us to the extent that we don't have them already. They took a very aggressive stance. At the same time, we know that the Austrian gallery wasn't internally as confident as they made it seem.
In 1948, the then director of the museum wrote to his predecessor, the case Bloch-Bauer is growing into a giant sea snake and is becoming very dangerous for us. I cannot understand why you didn't, in the Nazi time, acquire the signature of Bloch-Bauer to make it legal that we have the paintings. We have nothing, and we are in a very precarious and dangerous situation.
The provenance of the paintings has long been the subject of conflicting opinions.
Dr. Gerbert Frodel, who at this moment is the director of the Austrian Gallery, has been mistaken in his information about the provenance of these paintings. For example, Frodel maintained that the Golden Adelia came into the possession of the Austrian Gallery in 1936. Again, a completely specious date that has no bearing to reality. And that Adele Bloch-Bauer II, another painting that's in dispute, came into possession of the gallery in 1928. And again, this is a fantasy date. In 1928, Adele Bloch-Bauer II was hanging in the memorial room in the Elisabethstrasse Palais.
In September 1998, Randy Schoenberg, on behalf of Maria Altmann, submitted a claim for the return of the paintings by Austria.
The law entitles the Minister for Cultural Affairs to give away items which are now owned by the Austrian state, to give it away from Austrian property, to give it to somebody. There's a committee for the minister to give advice to her whether she should restitute it or not. But if the committee decides no, they don't want to give it back, then the object isn't given back. And as a claimant, you don't have any legal right to appeal against that.
In 1999, with her son Jim filming the trip, Maria flew to Vienna, hoping the Austrian authorities would soon accept that the Klimt paintings were stolen property.
When Maria Altmann first started claiming the Klimt paintings, she was treated like a foreigner. She was treated like somebody who would try to get something from the Austrian property, unjustified. The media would report, well, who is this Maria Altmann? She is not a daughter of Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer, so why does she have any right to claim anything? Plus, she is living in the States, so she must be rich, so why does she need to take away anything from us? So there was a very negative media for Maria Altmann in Austria.
While in Vienna, Maria had a meeting with the director of the Belvedere Gallery, Dr. Frodel.
Director Frodel said, now that we are alone, let's see what is in each other's hearts. And I said, well, we are really not alone. I have a lawyer, and tell me what is in your heart. And he said, well, we have plenty of landscapes. Take the landscapes, but just don't take the portraits.
I still remember a couple of phones with certain sources at this time, and they all told me the 5 paintings will be returned to Maria.
Maria visited the house of her uncle and aunt on Elisabethstrasse.
And this is where it went up, stairway going upstairs, and then the living quarters were upstairs, and that's where the Klimts were.
Okay.
He had a memorial room where all the Klimts were.
The Bloch-Bauers are very representative of the wealthy Viennese Jews in terms of the face of their collection. I mean, it's a very vivid case for so many reasons. I mean, one, that the palace in Vienna is taken over by the German railroad. I mean, I think the Austrian state railroad is still in the palace to this day. And think about it, railroads for historians of the Holocaust are such the symbols of the genocide. And for this Viennese Jewish family that are such victims of the Nazi regime, to have their residence taken over by the railways is really very symbolic and very, very powerful.
This was a store that when the Gestapo came and said, give me your jewelry. And so I said, there's more jewelry at the jeweler. And so we called Roset and Fischmeister, and I said, please send all my jewelry over.
Among the items taken from Rosette and Fischmeister was the necklace featured in the golden portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. It became one of the jewels in the collection of Emmy Göring, the wife of Field Marshal Hermann Göring, Hitler's Reich Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe. The necklace from the golden portrait has never been seen again. Like millions of other items looted by the Nazis during World War II, its fate remains a mystery.
Whenever I go to the antique stores of Vienna and I see old silver pieces and old Meissen china pieces, I immediately have the images of the bourgeoisie, the Jewish bourgeoisie of Vienna, and I ask myself, to whom did these coffee cups belong? And I could never see myself ever entering one of those stores and buying one of those pieces, because I would start shaking all over.
For the last surviving member of the Bloch-Bauer family, the streets of Old Vienna are filled with memories.
It was a big temple in Vienna, and that's where Louise got married. I got married at the temple that Daddy loved, because his father was a member there in the Turnergasse.
For Austrian Jews, many buildings have disturbing histories.
The Dorotheum, which was a fairly insignificant place before the Nazis came along, became a major auction house, thanks to the Nazis and their need to get rid of all the loot.
The Dorotheum would even make sales within the houses, the private houses of the victims. So they would invite people to go to the private houses where the furniture and the artworks, like they were standing there, were sold off.
You have to keep in mind, only a small portion of the art that was plundered was kept by the museums or institutions or the leading Nazis. The great majority of it had to be liquidated.
Today, the discussion about the theft of Jewish goods during the Nazi regime is dominated by the fact that the political establishment in Austria, but also the social establishment and the economic establishment, consists of many families that had once profited from the expropriation of Jews.
Elisabeth Gera, the Minister of Culture responsible for the new art restitution law, wanted the paintings to stay in Austria.
Hubertus Czernin took me for an interview with Minister Gera. She just had nothing but fun with me, and she thought I was the world's greatest comedian. She laughed and laughed. Please don't go, I have so much fun with you. And we talked about anything but the thing. And finally, after an hour, I said, Minister Gera, I'm sure you have other things to do. But before I go, I just want to mention one thing. When you were in New York, you said if you want to fight a last will, you have to go to court. Frau Minister, there was no last will. It was simply a request to her husband. And she said, oh, das weiß ich ja. I know that. And that was the only thing I discussed with her. And then I said goodbye, and that was it.
Minister Gera's decision depends on the advice she receives from the Beirat, the 9-person art restitution committee.
These paintings by Klimt are iconic images that are associated with the country's and certainly the city's cultural life. You know, they're national treasures, and most Austrians would view giving them back to Maria Altmann as a great loss for the country, as a kind of national tragedy.
A couple of weeks before the definite decision, I got a phone call by a source telling me suddenly it becomes much more difficult. I asked why, and the answer was that there are main forces in the government who don't think that we can restitute those paintings. They are very important for the country, and there's the special will of Adele Bloch-Bauer. There's a good excuse not to restitute them.
On June the 28th, 1999, Minister Gera announced that Austria would not return the Klimts to the Bloch-Bauer heirs.
Suddenly, Mrs. Gera stated the 5 paintings were not looted by the Nazis, never, although this is documented, because the Austrian gallery had always been the owner of the paintings after the death of Adele Bloch-Bauer.
They said, well, the will gave the paintings to the museum. That's not correct. It wasn't correct as a matter of law, and they didn't allow us to make any presentation or argument to the board, and they made up their mind sort of in a one-sided and unilateral way.
If you don't have the possibility to argue and to fight for your standpoint, then actually it becomes more or less senseless.
They never even tried to show the faintest gesture in showing we are willing to negotiate with you.
Back in Los Angeles, Maria Altmann and her attorney had to decide whether to fight on and how.
We were left with really only one option, and that was to go to court. We initially actually tried to go to court in Austria, but there were procedural difficulties. In Austria, they require a deposit of court costs that are a percentage of the value at stake in the litigation. So in this case, it was several $1 million would have had to been deposited just to file a lawsuit in Austria. We asked the government to waive that requirement, and they wouldn't do that.
I personally share the point of view that she wanted to switch to the United States because it may be easier for her. Perhaps she can make her claim more in the court of public opinion, and that she can reach in this way a quick settlement with the Republic of Austria.
This is a case where the art was not in the United States, the art was in Europe. The lawsuit was not against a private entity, but against the government of Austria. And it's always very difficult to file suits and be successful in litigation against foreign governments. And it's a case that was also quite old.
Randy Schoenberg decided to use a law that allows Americans to sue foreign governments in the United States.
After we filed suit, Austria required us to translate the complaint and serve it through the State Department. And several months later, they finally responded to the complaint by seeking to dismiss it on purely procedural grounds.
The Californian courts decided that they did have jurisdiction over Austria because of the way in which the Klimts had been commercialized in the United States. For 3 years, Maria and Randy fought their way through the California court system, winning at each stage. As a last resort, Austria appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States.
When the case was before the United States Supreme Court, the United States government, and specifically the Bush administration, filed a brief on behalf of Austria. It's called an amicus brief. It's a friend of the court brief. And they could have filed a brief on behalf of Mrs. Altmann. They didn't. They filed a brief on behalf of Austria.
The role of the U.S. government is problematic. They haven't actually come out and said that Mrs. Altmann's case will interfere with foreign relations or will impact national security in any way, because how could they? It's a case that concerns paintings on a wall. But they have come out and said, well, we don't like the legal ruling because it may hurt our position or the position of our allies and friendly countries in other cases.
At the Supreme Court, Austria and the United States were joined by France and Japan in opposing Maria in the American courts. In France, the courts were being asked to rule on the actions of French railways in the forced deportation of French Jews. In Japan, foreign slave labor victims and the so-called comfort women forced into having sex with Japanese troops were demanding compensation.
We never asked the Supreme Court to take our case. Never. We wouldn't have dared. We thought it would have no chance.
The only reason why we are really taking a stand in this case and why we are really not speaking about the settlement is because we are really convinced this is the property of Austria.
If you had asked just about any lawyer in the United States whether I had any chance of success, I think the conclusion would have been no way. It was an incredible long shot, and so I had a little bit of a gallows humor, I think, going into it, figuring I had nothing to lose, just give it my best shot and enjoy the experience. I prepared for this unprecedented experience of arguing in the Supreme Court. I did what we call moot court practice sessions, where professors and lawyers come and pretend they're judges and pepper you with questions.
You may be the opening wedge to bring every museum in the world to federal court in Los Angeles.
And I don't believe that will be so easy to do. It certainly wasn't so easy in this case. One cannot look at that in just a narrow jurisdictional sense in the United States. Her claims against Austria exist in the world. We got to the day of the argument in February of 2004, and when I finally got up to speak, it was after the Austrian government's lawyer and the U.S. government's lawyer. I got about 2 lines into it, and Justice Souter, one of the Supreme Court justices, interrupted me and asked me this question. And I looked at him, and I had not the slightest idea what he had just asked me. Not a clue how to answer. And I said, "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't understand the question. Could you please rephrase it?" And of course, there were chuckles from the audience in the back. My whole family was there, and Maria and her family were there. And the justices themselves sort of looked at me and smiled. And it was such an honest moment. I think it worked actually to my advantage in the long run, because they looked at me as if to say, "Oh, don't worry about it. We didn't understand the question either."
We have an independent judiciary, that American judges do not take marching orders from the government, and they really are able to decide the claims based upon just the merits of the case.
This case is related to Austria. I think there's no reason that this case should be seen in a foreign court, and the only reference point to the United States is that Maria Altmann is living there. This is the only reference point, no other.
I'm by now so frightfully hurt and angry that they base all their things on things that are not true. And that they will get away with this is just injustice that bothers me.
The Third Reich has been gone since 1945, but the crimes of the Nazis are still reverberating. For Maria Altmann, surviving the Nazis was not enough. Bruce Morton reports.
Altmann is suing under a U.S. law passed in 1976. Does it apply retroactively to events in the 1940s? Austria and the United States argue no.
Ein Urteil wird es vor der Sommerpause geben.
The case is a cornerstone for future decisions, where the government can and will start paying victims.
Zahlungen für Arisierungsopfer zu beginnen.
I'm happy that we're now finally able to discuss the case in court on a purely jurisdictional level.
After her day in court, Maria had to wait 3.5 months for the Supreme Court decision.
The incredible thing is that we won, and we won great. We didn't win just like that. We won the 6-3.
After the United States Supreme Court issued its decision saying that American courts do have jurisdiction over the case still had to go to trial and be decided on its merits. Austria had the option of continuing with the litigation.
We agreed to have an Austrian mediator come. He said, listen, you can either battle for years and years more, or perhaps we can come up with a procedure for resolving it faster. And the idea of arbitration came up, and so we agreed to that procedure.
The arbitration panel was comprised of 3 Austrian lawyers sitting in Austria and applying Austrian law. Their arbitration would be final and binding on both parties.
It was part of this deal to go back to Austria and have the Austrian arbitrators decide the case. Austria agreed that if they decide in our favor, we will get the paintings.
All the 3 of them have experience in arbitration, so I'm quite confident that they will make a reasonable decision.
The issue is, how did the Austrian government get possession and control of these paintings? Was it through the will of Adele Bloch-Bauer, or was it for export permits in 1948?
Das sind meine Eingangsbemerkungen. Wir stehen Ihnen jetzt.
The arbitration panel announced its decision to the press on January the 17th, 2006.
The arbitration award was basically a confirmation of our position all along, which was that Adela's will was a non-issue. It was non-binding and never had been, and therefore that these paintings were effectively given to the museum after the war in exchange for export permits, and as a result have to be returned.
Did you meet Klimt? Did you have any kind of...
No.
So you never met the legendary...
I'm old, but not that old.
How did you feel for you personally? Vindication? How would you say?
No vindication. I just felt great and happy.
Were you surprised, or did you have a feeling it was going in this direction?
I must say that I had a feeling it was going in this direction. My kids kept saying, you shouldn't be so positive, but I was. See, Randy, they'd say, how come I was so positive that you would win?
I don't know. I was not as positive as you were. I was.
Move. There we go.
Success.
60 years.
Court of Arbitration decided that the 5 Klimt paintings belong to the Altmann family. We will make the paintings available for restitution.
I'm sure there are people there that hate me and are angry and bitter. I had letters from people that I had never met assuring me that there are many Austrians that are very happy for me and are very happy with the decision, are proud of the judges that made this decision.
One does have the impression that without the persistent lawyers in the American legal system, Maria Altmann would have not been granted the right to her property.
It was a very disputable case, and the will was not clearly defined. We now have more documentation, and we need to acknowledge the outcome.
A condition of the arbitration was that Austria had the right of first refusal to buy the paintings at market price. Following consultations with Austrian and American advisors, the 5 paintings were valued at $300 million.
Of course, for somebody who's outside, it's a very high price, but for a country, for a rich country, if you want it, you can do it. It's also a political decision.
I believe that much effort has to be put into preserving this painting and any of the 5 paintings for Austria.
These paintings are really part of Austrian cultural heritage. They are very, very important for the time frame of the fin de siècle.
Well, I think they should stay in Austria because it's an Austrian painter, so it would be actually logical that the paintings would remain here in Austria.
I think they should belong in a museum so everyone can see. Yeah? But the lady is now the owner, and it's her decision what she wants to do.
Outraged at the prospect of the Austrian government paying $300 million for the paintings rather than giving money to the poor, one man threatened to slash them. For 4 days, they were taken off the walls.
Dame in Gold. Wer kauft nach der Rückgabe? Zu Gast im Studio.
The paintings, their history and future, provoked unprecedented public discussion about art, its meaning and value.
The idea to have to give them away collides with the Austrian identity, with the idea of Austrian identity.
I'm very skeptical of the whole notion that artwork should be equated with national identity. I think the more appropriate national identity would be Austria's complete rejection of its role in the Nazi period.
Decades of post-war amnesia have clouded Austria's identity and responsibilities. But things are slowly changing. This monument, nameless, by the British artist Rachel Whitred, is a memorial to the 65,000 Austrian Jews who died in the Holocaust. Since 1995, 30,000 Holocaust survivors have been given a symbolic payment of $6,000. Austria has returned more than 4,000 cultural items stolen by the Nazis. Today, Austria has $210 million in a general settlement fund that it is distributing in modest amounts to more than 200,000 outstanding Holocaust compensation claims.
So I have today 170 employees, 40 historians and 40 legal clerks, researching all the cases. Every time when we ask a survivor to fill in a form where we even only ask him for his address in 1938, we do re-traumatize this person. All the memories that they have been trying to get rid of come back through our restitution schemes. You cannot bring their youth back, you cannot bring their health back. So what can be done is money. You can mend their wounds maybe, but it's very little you can do. As my father said, I mean, his mother was killed in Auschwitz. If I give him $50 million, it won't bring back his mother.
$210 million have been set aside to meet Austria's outstanding Holocaust-related claims. $300 million were needed for Austria to acquire the 5 Klimt paintings.
The Republic of Austria is no longer willing to negotiate. We don't find it feasible to raise $300 million from our budget.
Unwilling to pay the market price for the stolen paintings, Austria sent them to Maria Altmann in California. Austrians admired the beauty of the golden portrait while helping to implement the Holocaust. Austria kept the stolen portraits captive throughout the Cold War. In the 21st century, the paintings and Austria have parted company.
Five paintings by the Austrian master Gustav Klimt, once stolen by the Nazis, go on display tomorrow in Los Angeles. It's the first time that they've been seen in this country. One of them, the golden portrait of a woman, is among the world's most famous paintings.
Claudia with Fox News Radio. I was just wondering if there's any sort of lingering resentment over the fact that you had to engage in a legal battle with the Austrian government to get the paintings back.
I was very angry at times, but now that we resolved it, I try to see the good part of it.
A question for you, Mr. Chairman. What is your reaction to the fact that Austrian government seemingly was not interested or able to raise $300 million?
They had opinion polls stating that 2/3 of the Austrians are against it. And so it was a beautiful story for them to tell, we would like to buy, but the offer of the heirs is so high that we can't afford it.
Jim Farber from the Daily Breeze. I have been told that your plans for the painting after this exhibit is they're going to be put on sale at Christie's.
There have been absolutely no decisions with regard to what will happen to the paintings next. The issue was and always has been that these paintings belonged to this family up until the time the Nazis came in and took them off the walls. And now, in the year 2006, they're finally returned to that family.
All I want is the paintings are accessible to the public. I wouldn't like them in private homes.
Now you're looking at the most expensive painting ever sold. Already hailed by its new owner as our Mona Lisa, the cosmetic tycoon Ronald Lauder has just paid a record £73 million for Klimt's glittering cold portrait for his Neue Gallery in Manhattan.
68 years after it was stolen, the future of the golden portrait has been settled. Its place in history is secure on public display in New York. Its sale will transform the lives of Maria, her sons and daughter, her nephews and nieces, and Randy Schoenberg. A 90-year-old Jewish woman took on the state of Austria and won.
I feel incredibly fortunate to see a just solution while so many people didn't live to see any solution.